Blog Talk Radio.
Something's gone wrong. For all our vigilance and battle scars over the Bill of Rights, have we let the flame of freedom's torch grow cold? Because there can be no torch to pass where there's no flame.
Freedom has only one enemy it cannot defeat, and that is negligence. So your presence here, now, today, is an act of reverence. Of all man's works beneath the heavens, none shines brighter than our Constitution. I think Jefferson and Paine, Adams, Madison, Mason, Franklin, I think they're looking down right now at us. I think they understand what we're trying to do, what we strive to do. Every time our country stands in the path of danger, an instinct seems to summon her finest first, those who truly understand her. When freedom shivers in the cold shadow of true peril, it's always the patriots who first hear the call. When loss of liberty is looming, as it is now, the siren sounds first in the hearts of freedom's vanguard.
Good evening, everybody. This is Joe Joseph, along with my co-host, John King. Tonight, we have a very special guest on this evening. We have Lord Christopher Monckton, 3rd Viscount of Brenchley, on tonight, outspoken critic of man-made global warming and everything New World Order. Lord Monckton, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Very, very good. Well, first of all, let me welcome you to the show. It's an honor to be able to speak to you, especially with all the work you're doing, trying to inform the people of just all the rampant corruption that's afoot in the world today. So welcome to the show.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you, Joe, and with all your freedom-loving listeners.
Well, I certainly do appreciate it. Now, you see the stuff that's going on right now over in France. Austerity measures are being talked about, and now they're talking about the same austerity measures in the UK. What's your take on it, and do you think that that the resistance being put up by the French citizenry, do you think that that's an effective way of fighting it?
The first thing is that the nations of the West, many of them are financially bankrupt. There's no real other word for it. And when that happens, you have two choices if you're a government that really cares about its people. You look the other way, go on borrowing like there's no tomorrow, and you end up like Robert Mugabe, where $100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar note won't buy you a loaf of bread. That's one way you can go. The other way is you try to face the deficit and sort it out. And in France, President Sarkozy is making some really quite modest changes to the way the country runs. Mm-hmm. He's saying that instead of retiring at 60, you retire at 62 in future. Well, that's not the end of the world. I'm coming up to 60 already, and I'm not planning to retire anytime soon, partly because I can't afford to. And so, I would not be going to the barricade to fight against that idea. And in the UK, we've had a new coalition government. The two parties that were in opposition before are now in government, and they're trying to undo 13 years of the wildest fiscal and monetary irresponsibility on the part of the socialist government that was eventually thrown out of office. And the national debt in Britain, just to give you an idea of how fast it rose. When I first went to work for Margaret Thatcher in 1982, the accumulated national debt of Britain was 100 billion sterling. And it had taken 350 years for governments to borrow that much in peace and in war to cover the deficits in their expenditure. 350 years, 100 billion sterling. This year alone, the government will be borrowing 200 billion sterling in 1 year. Twice the debt that it had taken 350 years to accumulate is now being borrowed every year. And even after the so-called austerity measures, which the coalition announced yesterday in Parliament, the amount of borrowing will be going up in at least each of the next 5 years. That's how little cutting is really going on.
Now, why do you think the increase? What has attributed to this large increase that we're seeing? I mean, I know over in the United States we have Obamacare now, and that has contributed to it a lot. But I mean, how much of that, let me ask you this, how much of that do you think is interest paying that debt to the banksters?
Well, we know that that's the problem in the United Kingdom, because we are now having to repay to those who have lent money to the government at a rate of 1 billion sterling per week. That alone, therefore, is 50 or 60 billion sterling per year. In other words, just the interest these days on the national debt that accumulated so very, very quickly in the lifetime of just one totally irresponsible government. Just the interest amounts to that we have to pay back every year amounts to half of the accumulated national debt of 350 years before Margaret Thatcher took office. That is how serious this is. It's 175 years worth of national debt is now what we're paying every year in interest alone. That's just one small measure of the scarcely unbelievable and most certainly scarcely creditable financial irresponsibility of the previous government here. Now, your problem in the United States, for instance, is that you have not only Obamacare, but you have the stimulus package, which was effectively a wish list drawn up by a communist pressure group that Obama was very close to. And that paid, again, billions or even trillions to various socialist causes that were not at all friendly to the future of freedom, democracy, prosperity, and the American Constitution. These were causes that were trying to tear down the economy of the United States in particular and the West in general. And yet, Obama threw trillions of your money at this. The stimulus package was not for America, it was for socialism. And of course, like all such stimulus packages, it has failed to achieve the objective of reducing unemployment, putting more money back in the hands of businesses who definitely and desperately need it to keep going, and of people who are looking for jobs. They have not benefited from this because it was never intended to benefit the poorest people in America. It was intended to benefit political causes only. And the problem is that Obama is still taking no steps to introduce austerity measures, to cut back on spending, to rein in on the debt that is growing in the United States. And so unless and until the opposition Republicans in the midterm elections take control of the House and perhaps even of the Senate, though I don't think they'll quite make it in the Senate, unless they then speak out with a much clearer voice than I have heard the Republicans do to date, pointing out the enormous, continuing, and deliberate financial damage that your governing class, and not just the Democrats, but with often the acquiescence of the Republicans, is inflicting on the United States. Unless the Republicans now speak out clearly, America is going down. Because unless there is the right of the people to make money and to keep at least the greater part of the money they make, then it is freedom itself that's being taken away.
That is a very stirring account of what's going on. And I have to say, you're absolutely right. And the corruption goes much farther than that. I'm sure you've heard recently about the real estate debacle that's going on in the United States, and how there's a $45.5 trillion bubble that is about ready to pop, and it has to deal with mortgages and the way that mortgages were processed. There's no line of accountability. Banks would take these mortgages and they would cut them up and they'd sell them to different stakeholders, sometimes selling them time and time again. And now they're being called to account because these people that are being foreclosed on are going to court and challenging them, and they're winning because the bank cannot prove ownership or a line of custody of the house. So if this bubble bursts the way I think it is, of course there's no bailout that can cover a $45.5 trillion bubble, but if the United States economy falls, then where do you think the world sits, in your opinion?
Well, the world falls with the United States. It's still so large an economy that without it, we all catch a cold, and not just catch a cold, we all go under. We all get pneumonia, if you like. It's very serious what has happened in the United States. And one of the most extraordinary and disfiguring things about the time when Gordon Brown called a summit of the G20, he was the socialist prime minister here, your socialist prime minister there, came and met in London with various other largely socialist leaders from around the world, and they decided that they would throw money at the banks in an attempt to stave off the inevitable. And whose money were they throwing at the banks? Not their own, of course, but our money, the taxpayers' money. Mm-hmm. And why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work for a very simple reason, which I pointed out at the time, and everybody said I was just pooping on the party and being silly. I said, look, call me old-fashioned, but if you're going to pay money to these banks because they say they've got into trouble with their loan books, then not a penny in respect of any loan over which the bank can't establish title. If they've lost track of who owns what, then why should the taxpayer just throw trillions at them to bail them out when we don't even know where our money is going and the banks don't know where it's going either? I just said it's really common sense that what you do as a government is you say, right, for each loan that you can establish title, we'll make sure that that loan is to some extent supported so that the owner of the house doesn't find himself foreclosed upon just because the banking system has become inept. But in every case where the bank has lost track of the loan, doesn't know what the position is, hasn't kept an eye on the property to make sure that its owner maintained it and insured it as he should, then in every single one of those loans, not a penny to the bankers. And if that means that people who have been feckless or reckless end up with the houses that they ought to be paying for free and clear because the banks have failed to keep track of their own paperwork in the most elementary and basic fashion, then let the banks go under. The idea that banks are too big to fail is a chimera. It's a very clever one. It's a notion that the banks themselves are all too willing to foster, because that means they've got a one-way bet. They can borrow our money and charge us huge interest rates at it. They can borrow them government's money and charge interest on it. And yet they cannot fail because the government will just pour trillions in if it looks as though they're going under. Now, this has long been a defect in our banking system. When you let the banks get too big, when any one bank gets too large a stake in the overall system, that if it fails, it pulls the rest of them down, that's the time to let the banks collectively go under. Now, how do you do this without the entire economy collapsing? It's remarkably easy. The first thing you have to do is get back to the idea of an honest currency. May I explain how honest currency works? Because in the world at the moment, nobody